Being in the middle of the offseason, now is the perfect time to go back and reminisce on the good old days. The 2010s decade was the decade that myself and a lot of other people grew up watching football and really fell in love with the sport. But in today's video, we're going to be looking back at the decade and the quarterbacks, some of the best ones from the decade, and ranking them on this tier list. We have elite, great starter, solid starter, average starter, and backups. Let's go ahead and get things started with a really easy one. As you can see, we have Aaron Rodgers first. Without a doubt, elite level starter. He had the one Super Bowl in 2010, 7-time Pro Bowler. The only years where he didn't make the Pro Bowl were really just because of injuries. He was absolutely outstanding in the 2010s. That success carried on into the early 2020s. Now he's a little bit older, of course, but in the 2010s, he was absolutely one of the best players in the NFL just about every year. And that's why he's going to be in the elite category without a doubt. Next up is another really good player, Ben Roethlisberger. Not sure if I can put him in elite specifically for the 2010s. Once again, this isn't just overall quarterbacks. This is specifically their body of work in the 2010s. Ben Roethlisberger did a lot of his playoff winning in the 2000s. He does have the Super Bowl appearance in 2010. They didn't end up losing that game, though. 5-time Pro Bowler in the decade, though, so I think he definitely has a spot in the great starter category. Wasn't able to win a Super Bowl in the decade or anything like that, and never really even had MVP hype or anything close to that, but I think he's definitely better than just a solid starter. He was able to elevate those Pittsburgh teams for years in the decade and had a lot of success, so I think self-explanatory there. He goes in the great starter tier. Next up is a really interesting player. We have Alex Smith. Smith is one of those players where if you were to look at just his body of work in the 2000s, you would think of him as a bust. But in reality, in the 2010s, when he moved to the Kansas City Chiefs under Andy Reid, he was really able to reach his full potential. 3-time Pro Bowler in the decade, but never really had any sort of playoff success, not even making a conference championship game or anything like that. But the longevity is definitely commendable. I think he was a solid starter for much of the decade, but definitely one of the better solid starters just because of the longevity. He didn't have a short-lived peak or anything. He had 5 to 6 really solid years in Kansas City, but once again, just never had the playoff success to move up into the great starter tier. Now, next up is a really interesting player. We have Andy Dalton. I think people underestimate that this guy was actually really solid in his peak years in the 2010s. People think of him now as just a backup, a guy that stayed in the league probably longer than he should have been. But in the 2020s, he's definitely down here. But the 2010s, he was very, very solid. Once again, the longevity in the 2010s, his peak, is actually a lot better than people make it out to be. He was a 3-time Pro Bowler, which honestly caught me by surprise. He was very solid in his years with the Bengals. Once again, absolutely no playoff success, which is why he can't be up here. But the regular season numbers were very solid. I think he's definitely a solid starter. Not as good as Alex Smith in his peak years with Kansas City, but Dalton with the Bengals was definitely a decent player. Next up is Blake Bortles. Bortles was only in the league for a few years. From 2014 to 2019, he was a relevant starter. He did have one year where he threw for 35 touchdowns, but that year he also led the league in interceptions. And his best year as a starter in terms of success in the playoffs and just winning overall, he wasn't really the focal point of the offense whatsoever, and they were carried by a great defense. So the playoff success is definitely a little bit misleading. Honestly, I don't even know if I can put him in average starter just because, once again, no longevity at all. He was only average for like 1 or 2 years, but I'll give Bortles the benefit of the doubt. I think he's pretty close to backup. We'll see how this list shapes up. Maybe I'll move him down. No Pro Bowls, was never even really close to a Pro Bowl. Mostly losing seasons other than that 1 year in Jacksonville that people tend to remember. Next up is Andrew Luck. Once again, super short career, but the difference with Luck is he was absolutely incredible in his short tenure with the Colts. He was a 4-time Pro Bowler, including making the Pro Bowl in his first 3 years as a starter. He was destined to be an elite level player, but because his career ended so early and because the Colts were never able to put a competent offensive line or really a competent team around him, never really had the playoff success or sustained longevity to be an elite player, but was certainly a great starter. So next up is Brock Osweiler. Honestly, haven't said that name in years. Not sure why he's even on this list. One of the more forgettable quarterbacks of the decade for sure. He's a backup. If this is a guy that should have been a backup and I think played more games as a starter than he should have, I'm going to go ahead and put him in the backup tier because I don't think he was ever even an average starter in his career. I think he should have been a backup more and was a backup for an extended period of time anyway, so he goes in the backup category pretty easily. Next up is Cam Newton. Now, at the peak of his career, Cam Newton was definitely an elite level player, the MVP, multi-time Pro Bowler, but his peak was very short, didn't have the longevity, in my opinion, to be an elite level starter. I think he was definitely a great starter, though, probably towards the bottom of this list. I think Luck, actually, he can go above Luck just because the MVP, making the Super Bowl, that one season alone was incredible, but the rest of his career, definitely underwhelming. If you take the rest of his career, he would probably go here, one of these categories, but that 2015 season was magical, so we'll go ahead and put him right between Roethlisberger and Luck. Next up is Josh Rosen. Not much needs to be said. He was a high draft pick, was supposed to be a decent player at least, never ended up materializing in the league though. So next up is Carson Wentz, and I've actually went ahead and added a tier to this tier list just because I don't think consistently Carson Wentz fit into any one of these categories. Maybe early on in his career you could make the argument for elite, maybe great starter, solid starter at certain points, but then there were other years where he was benched, wasn't very good at all. This guy had absolutely no sort of consistency in the decade. You can obviously blame some of that on injuries. It's kind of unfortunate what happened to Carson Wentz. But once again, some years up here, that Pro Bowl MVP caliber 2017 season goes up here, but was never consistently up here. And then was also never consistently bad either. He had his moments. He's a volatile player. I think that's really the best way to describe him. Next up is Case Keenum, who I honestly haven't heard of in a long time as well. Put up a few very solid years in the league, but never really a consistent starter. He goes in the average starter tier just because of the lack of consistent success. Had some years as a backup, really flamed out of the league pretty fast. With his years in Minnesota, he had that 1 year with some decent playoff success, I guess. Other than that, really wasn't much there. I'm going to go ahead and put him in the average starter tier. Next up is Colin Kaepernick. A guy that, honestly, in 20, 30 years, even though he started in a Super Bowl and played very well in that game, I think a lot of people are going to be forgetting about this guy. But for the people that grew up in the 2010s and watched this guy play, it was definitely something else. I mean, never a Pro Bowler, never that type of quarterback, but his dual threat ability, he was just so much fun to watch. Definitely flamed out of the league. He's a volatile player. I mean, there were some years where you could put him here, potentially. He was never elite, but there were some years you could put him solid to great starter, especially that Super Bowl year where they almost won it. But there were also a lot of years where you could put him down here as well. Never had a consistent showing in any one of these tiers. He goes in the volatile tier. Next up is Dak Prescott, who, if you just look up his Pro Football Reference, it looks like he's a great starter just based on the numbers. Dak, similarly to Alex Smith and Andy Dalton, never has had the playoff success. That could potentially change in the 2020s, but as for the 2010s specifically, I wouldn't call him an average starter just because he was, and did lead them to a couple playoffs and a couple playoff victories as well, something that Andy Dalton and Alex Smith haven't really done much of either, so he goes in the higher end of the solid starter category. Next up is Matt Ryan, one of the really good quarterbacks that people tend to forget about. Obviously, that MVP season was magical for him. Multiple-time Pro Bowler in the decade as well. I think he was a great starter. I think he's towards the bottom end of the tier just because I think his peak wasn't as high as a guy like Cam Newton, and he also wasn't as consistent as a guy like Ben Roethlisberger, but he was always talented, very solid player. I think I'll go ahead and put him above Andrew Luck because he did have the playoff success with Atlanta. Next up is Derek Carr, who, to my surprise, was a 3-time Pro Bowler in the 2010s. I honestly forgot that Derek Carr was decent at one point. As of late, obviously, he hasn't been the same quarterback, but this is obviously just the 2010s, and I was originally thinking of putting him in the average starter tier, but looking at the stats, and I guess the eye test from the early 2010s, remembering some of those good regular seasons that he had, he can go ahead and go into the solid starter tier. Definitely towards the bottom of the tier, though, because never had the playoff success. The one year where he had a chance to be in the playoffs, he ended up getting hurt and never even ended up playing. So he'll be in towards the bottom of this tier just because I think he's definitely better and a more consistent player than Bortles or Case Keenum ever were. Next up is Deshaun Watson, an interesting case on this list just because, first of all, he joined the NFL in 2017, so had a late start to the decade, but from 2018 to 2020 was a Pro Bowler every single year. So I think for his overall career, you would have to put him in Volatile just because in the 2020s, obviously a lot of stuff has happened. The guy's just not the same anymore. But in the 2010s, he was a very solid player. I just don't think he has the longevity to go up here. This is actually a really tough one just because the guy was a great starter when he did play. I'm going to put him at the very top of solid starter. Never had the playoff success. Never had the longevity as well to be a consistently great starter. But at his peak for a solid 2 years, he was a great starter in my opinion. But it wasn't really his fault. He didn't get into the league earlier. But it is kind of his fault that he's fallen off since then. So he'll go ahead and land in the solid starter tier. Next up is Drew Brees. Don't really have to look up the stats or anything. He's going into the elite category. He's one of those guys where the stats were just so incredibly good that accolades and winning doesn't matter too much. And of course, he passed the eye test as well. He was fun to watch. He was amazing. Made very little mistakes when he played. And if it weren't for the Saints putting consistently really bad defenses around Drew Brees, I think he potentially could have been even above Aaron Rodgers, but he'll be towards the lower end of the elite category just because the playoff success wasn't great, but he did have a few runs there, and he was just an amazing player, even in the 2010s. Next up is Eli Manning, two-time Super Bowl champion, but in the 2010s, one of those Super Bowls came. It's really interesting. Obviously isn't going to go down here. He's potentially volatile just because the guy was never super consistent. I mean, he led the league in interceptions 3 times, only had 2 to 3 years where he had over 30 touchdowns. I'm going to go ahead and put him in solid starter. He'll go above all these guys just because the playoff success was absolutely there. It's tough to say that at his peak he was better than Deshaun Watson, but the winning speaks for itself. That alone makes me want to put him here. I would move him up, but the numbers was never there. He was never a super great player. Always just a decent player. Was good enough to lead the team to victories. That's what he did. Outside of that Super Bowl year, though, it was rough for him. He probably would have been a lot lower if it weren't for that year. But that year does exist. We have to obviously value that in, which is why he's towards the top of the tier. Next up is Jameis Winston. Honestly, I think it might be a little bit disrespectful to put him next to Blake Bortles and Case Keenum. I think he's definitely a better player. But as for the 2010s overall, came into the league towards the latter half of the decade in 2015. Honestly, now that I think about it, he might have been a solid starter for 1 or 2 of those years. He did make the Pro Bowl in his rookie season as an alternate. Not really sure how much value that holds, though. But honestly, all these guys in the solid starter tier are multiple-time Pro Bowlers. Jameis Winston, just that 1 year as a rookie. I'm going to go ahead and keep him in the average starter tier. And I think that's where he's going to be for pretty much the rest of his career. I think he has the potential to be here even in the 2020s, even though he's been a backup for most of it. But that's aside from the point. He's going to be in the average starter tier. Next up is Jared Goff. Once again, came into the 2010s very late. Of course, the same draft class as Carson Wentz. And Goff has consistently been a solid starter. In the 2020s, he's making the argument to potentially be moved up. I think he's definitely not as good as Manning or Watson. For the 2010s specifically, wasn't as good as Dak. Now that's arguable. You could probably put Dak below Goff in terms of today quarterbacks. But for the 2010s, Goff was probably a little bit worse. Did have the Super Bowl appearance in 2019. But other than that, never put up great stats with the Rams. His best years are definitely ahead of him in Detroit. Next up is Jay Cutler. I think he goes towards the top of the average starter tier. Some people might view this as disrespect, but when you look at it, he was actually never a Pro Bowler in the 2010s. I think most people just remember him nostalgically for being a very decent player, I guess, and having some moments here and there, but had a couple winning seasons, also led the league in interceptions a couple times, so definitely cannot be above this tier, but he's also above all the other guys in the tier. Next up is Jimmy Garoppolo. I'm honestly not sure why he's on this list at all. He was never really a full-time starter until 2019, and that 1 year he was solid. This doesn't really make sense to me why he's even on this list. I guess we'll go ahead and put him in average starter as well. You could argue that he's a solid starter, but was never a Pro Bowler. I don't know why he's even on here, but we'll go ahead and throw him in the average starter tier. Next up is Joe Flacco, and honestly the thing that surprised me the most about this guy is that he was never once selected to a Pro Bowl. I think that's honestly a little disrespectful. He had a couple good years, multiple winning seasons with the Ravens, and of course the Super Bowl victory as well. I think Flacco, he's the first quarterback that's in the solid starter without having a Pro Bowl. He won a Super Bowl. I'll go ahead and put him right below Eli Manning just for the Super Bowl alone pretty much. He goes in the tier pretty respectively. Honestly, I've spent about 5 minutes trying to figure out who this guy is, and the only number 12 that I remember on the Chicago Bears is Matt Barkley. So I'm just going to go ahead and assume that's Matt Barkley, and the guy was literally a backup. I mean, I don't know why he's on here. There's no debate with him. He was a backup, so by definition, he goes in the tier. That's pretty much all I have to say about him. Moving on to somebody a little bit more relevant to the decade, we have Kirk Cousins. Also a really inconsistent player. I'd say it's disrespect to put him down here in the average starter tier. He's definitely above Derek Carr. I'll put him below Andy Dalton. I think overall, career-wise, Kirk Cousins is better, but for the 2010s, Andy Dalton was very solid. Kirk Cousins was more inconsistent. I think he'll go right here, just for the 2010s specifically. Couple decent years with Minnesota and Washington, but nothing crazy. No playoff success either, so just a solid starter. Next up is Marcus Mariota, never selected to a Pro Bowl, same draft class as Jameis Winston, and he's going to go probably in a similar tier. I think now he's obviously a backup type of player, but in the 2010s, he was an average starter, nothing crazy. I'll put him right beside Jameis Winston, two disappointing players going number 1 and number 2 overall in 2015. Never really materialized. But next up, we have Mark Sanchez. I think it's slightly disrespectful to put him alongside these three. We'll put him at the bottom end of average starter, right below Marcus Mariota. Not much needs to be said about that. Next up is Matt Schaub, one of the most forgotten players of the decade, but he was decent. Towards the beginning of the decade, he was solid. He made a Pro Bowl. Towards the end of the decade, he definitely flamed out. I'll put him towards the bottom of solid starter. He can go right below Derek Carr. But I think it's a little bit disrespectful to put him in the average starter tier. He can be a solid starter. Next up is Matthew Stafford. Now, Matthew Stafford's Super Bowl win did come in the 2020s, so if we're just going off of the 2010s, I think Stafford was a solid starter. He always had the talent with Detroit. They were never able to use it properly. And for the 2010s specifically, he can go above Deshaun Watson and Dak, but slightly below Joe Flacco and Eli Manning just because they have the Super Bowls. Stafford definitely evolved since his Lions days, but those are definitely interesting times for Lions fans, and Matthew Stafford, he can go in the solid starter tier. Next is Mitch Trubisky. I guess at the peak of his powers, he was solid. Now he's a backup, but I guess if we're going based off the 2010s, he was drafted in like 2017. He was an average starter. Nothing crazy about him. He never should have been picked number 2 overall. That was always a bad idea. People even knew that at the time. He can go in the average starter tier. Nick Foles. I think this is definitely interesting. I think he can go in volatile. He never started a full season as a starting quarterback, so you could argue that he goes down here. But that one Super Bowl victory gives me enough respect to put him in this tier. I think it's definitely better than being a backup, being volatile. At least you were good for a little bit. But never had the consistency in the 2010s. It's funny to me that 2 Eagles quarterbacks go down in this tier, and they both played in the same season where the Eagles won a Super Bowl. Volatile tier isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just not necessarily a good thing either. Next up is Patrick Mahomes. This one's interesting just because the guy only played 2 years in the 2010s as a starting QB, and I do value longevity in terms of this list. I think we can go ahead and make an exception for Patrick Mahomes just because the MVP, Super Bowl MVP in the decade, I mean, that's already more than some of these guys have accomplished. That's already more than Drew Brees accomplished the entire decade. So to an extent, longevity can be thrown out the window to make a couple exceptions here and there. But he can go, just out of respect for the longevity that Brees had, he can go below Brees in terms of the decade. But if we were doing 2020s, he would absolutely be at the top of the list. Probably the best player since he entered the league. But for 2020s, still an elite player. Next up is Peyton Manning, who's honestly a complete outlier when it comes to this list just because he did most of his work in the 2000s, but In the 2010s, the guy was still great. He had 55 touchdown passes one year, won the Super Bowl, of course. He can go towards the very bottom of the elite tier. Once again, no longevity in terms of the 2010s. Obviously, his career overall, he had longevity. Just like Patrick Mahomes, we're going to make an exception on the whole longevity thing just because the guy was so electric for about a year or two in the decade. Next up is Phillip Rivers. Incredible longevity in the decade. Never had playoff success, though. You just can't be in the elite tier. He's going to go above Cam Newton just because I think his peak was never as high, but his ability to stay consistent in the decade was certainly commendable. He's probably going to be one of those guys that's not talked about too much in a few years, but he's a guy that if you grew up watching, you know Phillip Rivers, and you know he was a very, very good player. Next up is RG3. Never had a chance to even do anything. He had those couple years where he was very, very good. At the peak of his powers, he was a great starter. But towards the latter half of his career as a starter, he was not very good. He can go in the volatile tier. Honestly, there's no real order in terms of these four. They're just kind of here just because there's no real spot for them on the list. But going to a guy that was a little more consistent in the decade is Russell Wilson. Always a top 5 to 10 quarterback, in my opinion, for the decade. He's fallen off in the 2020s, but in the 2010s specifically, he was a great starter. The longevity itself, I'll put it above Andrew Luck and the Super Bowl win. But the MVPs from Newton and Ryan, Russell Wilson never had that type of season, so he's going to go slightly below them. Next up is Ryan Tannehill. Revived his career when he went to Tennessee. Has that Pro Bowl in 2019, but I'm going to go ahead and put him in the average starter tier. I don't think he was ever a solid starter for more than 1 year. I think for the overwhelming majority of the decade, he was average. Next up is Sam Bradford. The guy was actually better than some of you guys might remember. He had one decent season. He was never terrible or anything like some people might expect, but he was also never very good either. I think he's literally the definition of an average starter. He can go right in between, somewhere over there. Next up, another Vikings quarterback, Teddy Bridgewater. He has that 2015 season where he made the Pro Bowl. Other than that, he's going to go in the average starter tier as well. Just a guy that not a lot of people really even think about outside of how unlucky he's been with injuries. If it weren't for injuries, I think his ceiling could have been solid starter, but he's going to fall right in the average starter tier. Next is Tony Romo, who I originally wanted to put in the great starter tier, but he only has one Pro Bowl, unfortunately banged up for a lot of the 2010s, so I'm going to have to move him down to the solid starter tier. As much as I wanted to put him up here, just was never super consistent in the decade. He obviously did have that one playoff run. At the peak of his powers, he was a great starter. I'm going to have to dock him a few points just because he was never super consistent. He'll go somewhere in the middle of solid starter. Almost done with this list here. A couple guys who I view pretty similarly. Tyrod Taylor and Ryan Fitzpatrick are both average starters. As for Fitzpatrick, who I think is definitely the more interesting player, he had stints where he looked solid and even great. He's had stints where he's looked pretty bad. Just an inconsistent player. Average starter for sure. And then there's Tyrod Taylor. Was never really expected to be anything crazy. He was all right. He's a backup for most of his career. Might honestly have to move him down, but I think at his peak, he was an average starter. And then we saved the best for last. The winningest player in NFL history, one of the winningest players in sports history, is Tom Brady. Caps off this list, saving the best for last, goes to the very, very top of the tier. That's self-explanatory, of course. Don't even have to pull up the numbers. But that's my list. Let me know if you disagree with anything you see here. Looking back at the list, my top 10 quarterbacks of the 2010s, in this order: Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, Patrick Mahomes, Peyton Manning, Ben Roethlisberger, Phillip Rivers, Cam Newton, Matt Ryan, and I'm still deciding on this last one. Should it be Andrew Luck? Or I'll give the respect to Russell Wilson's longevity. He can be at the 10 spot. Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comment section. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the like button if you enjoyed as well. If you guys enjoyed this video, I'll be coming out with something similar to this, maybe for other positions like wide receivers or running backs. But that'll just be based on what you guys think of this video. But that's going to do it. Here's my list one final time. I hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one.